All right, let's pray, and then we'll do a little review, and then we'll get started here in chapter 11. Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for these men and the reason they're here. And God, as always, we express our thanks and our gratitude for the relationship we have with you, for the hope in the future, for the truth that we can stand on, and just ask for your help in understanding it better so that we can share it with those who need it, so we can live by it and show that kind of fruit in our lives, so we can be benefit and help to people around us and bless the church that we're part of. And we just express our gratitude for allowing us to be part of your family, your church, and ask your help in doing the best we can. And to that end, I'm asking your blessing on our time together tonight, in Jesus' name. All right. Just a few questions to kind of bring us up to speed where we've been. Back in chapters 8 and 9, Paul really hits the subject of giving. In fact, it's probably one of the best places in the New Testament to get New Covenant teaching on the topic of giving. But when he starts off talking about giving, who does Paul use as an example? Starts right off at the beginning of the 8th chapter, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And instead of just telling them, hey, this is what you need to do, he starts by using examples. And I think that's very beneficial. In fact, it makes me think of how many times in the book of Acts, when the Apostle Paul had the opportunity, how many times did he tell his story? Over and over again. Every chance he had to witness, a lot of times when the Scripture actually gives us examples of what he said, a lot of times he engaged people and he talked about what they were doing, but many times he'd bring up his own experiences. And more than once he told about his own conversion. Well, here in dealing with the subject of giving, instead of just talking about the topic, he gives some illustrations. And who is it that he points to? The Macedonian churches. And that's the region to the north. Corinth would be down here in the south, and Macedonia would be north of there. What are some of the cities that you're familiar with? There's one in particular that just jumps out at me that's in Macedonia. Philippi. Say it louder. Philippi. Yeah. And the reason Philippi gets me so much, and I've probably said this too many times, but the very fact that they supported Paul throughout his ministry. And he wouldn't accept any pay from Corinth, but he did accept it from Philippi. Okay, now having said that, he uses them as an example. In what way are they a great example of giving? What are some of the things that he says about the churches of Macedonia?
They're very poor, but they're very generous.
Yeah. So number one, it doesn't make any difference. You can't get away with this excuse, well, I don't have enough. Because that's not a criteria. Yeah, you may not have enough, you may not be able to give as much as other people, but it's not a matter of amount. And so that's one of the things he hits, so that they're poor. What else does he say about them? That is one of the dominant things that he says. He says, out of great poverty. But what was their attitude in giving?
Joyfully.
Wow, great joy. This was like an exciting thing. They begged for the opportunity. Hey, is this something we can get? I got to tell you, because I just got the inside scoop today from people who were counting. We just put those pigs out, over $200.
Yeah.
We asked people just put in $1. That just tickles me. That tells me that people are just looking for an opportunity of, hey, that's something. I love stuff like that. So out of poverty, with great joy. What else does it say about them? What did they do? What did they do first before they gave money? They gave themselves. It's kind of like, we're all in. Died to self. It's all about God. It's all about Him. It's all about His ministry. And because of that, they were a great example. What does it say about how much you should give? What do these chapters say, especially in chapter 8? What does it say about how much somebody should give? Say what?
Tell her.
Tell her. Okay, no doubt that's, instead of explicitly stated, that's more implied. But the idea of sacrifice, because it says they gave beyond their ability. In other words, the idea is someone had to give. They had to cut somewhere else to be able to do what they were able to do. Very true. Not the point I was looking for, but very true.
Well, it's not a sacrifice if you're not sacrificing.
That's true.
You know.
That's true. That's true. But what does it specifically say about how much you're supposed to give? Does the Bible does it identify a percentage? No. What does it say?
Cheerfully. Well,
Okay, cheerfully,
according to your faith.
according to.
Well, according to. I was going to say according to your ability, but you know, I thinking more along the lines of your spiritual maturity.
Right, and I totally agree with that. And also according to what you have, proportional. The idea is somebody doesn't have a whole lot, God doesn't expect a whole lot. He does expect people to give. He expects people to participate. But to whom much is given, much is required. So some people, does God expect more from more people? Yeah, but the point he's making is, you don't have much, you know what? God doesn't expect much. But he does expect participation. He does expect to get involved. One of the things that gets me so much, this whole thing is against this backdrop of Paul's unwillingness to accept any money from the church at Corinth. So he won't accept any money personally, but he spends the better part of 2 chapters hammering away at the idea that you've got to give something to help out the poor saints and help out God's work in other places. So, yeah.
We have a point. I was going to a Baptist church when I was young, which is just down the road. My parents didn't go. My mom was divorced, remarried. She married a lawyer, pretty wealthy, living in Melbourne, and church was right. So I was going to that church when I wasn't going with my buddies whose father was a pastor at the church. But I just go to that church. My mom used to give me offering money.
Yeah.
For tithing.
Yeah.
And she used to give me like $1.
Yeah.
And I'm like, Mom. $1? And I got up where she gave me like $10, but it took me a while because and it hurt. And I knew back then that this isn't their lifestyle. She gave me $1, you know.
You know, my brother-in-law used to call that, he called it chump change in God. Yeah. Yeah. Good for you, Daryl.
Think you make change?
All right.
Come back with change back.
That might change.
Chapter 9 brings up the law of the harvest. What is the law of the harvest?
So all the harvests leave the outside of the field.
Okay.
What are you talking about?
Nope, but that's, again, you say something biblically true. I'm so glad.
That way you at least can give something.
That's
Because if you
exactly
can't
right.
bring
That
an
way-
offering, it's the outside of the fields are left, you go get the grain, you bring it in.
Yeah.
First fruits.
Okay, first fruits, but the law of the harvest is,
If you don't sell
percentage
a
of
lot,
your
you don't
sow to
reap a
reap.
lot.
yeah, you know what? You can't plant 5 seeds and expect to pull in 12 trucks worth of crops. You know, you got to plant a lot to get a lot. You reap what you sow, but you're only going to be able to reap a lot if you sow a lot.
It's not Jack and the Beanstalk, one bean and field.
Magic beans, yeah.
All right. Okay, twice in this passage too, it also talks about God enriching or God blessing or God taking care of us. For what purpose? He enriches us, He blesses us, He'll take care of us so that we will be able to,
Disciple.
okay, disciple.
To
And in chapter 9 verse 11 is the one reference I wrote down, but he will enrich us for the very purpose so that we can continue to be more generous. So the idea of, even if you interpret this financially, which I think is part of the whole picture, but I don't think it's limited to that. But if you interpret this financially, you reap what you sow, you give and God blesses. The point is God will bless so that you will be able to continue to give, not just so that we can get rich. That's not the purpose of the blessing there. Okay, on into chapter 10. What is the goal of biblical warfare? Remember, he talks about taking up the weapons that we use. What's the end game here? Do you remember how he identifies that? We're going to keep fighting this fight until what? Until we take captive something. What are we trying to take captive?
Rebellious thoughts.
Okay, rebellious thoughts, and which verse is that? Is that verse
5?
Verse 5? Yeah, my translation said till every thought is captive. Man, I love that idea. It makes you think about why is it that, what was the reason given that God brought the flood and destroyed the world? Because every thought and intention of the heart was continually wicked, evil. And the polar opposite of that is our end game, until every thought is captive and submissive to the will of God, which I'm guessing we'll never reach the end game in this life. But that's the goal. That's the goal. And I love that. Wow, do I love that. Okay, let me see. Next question. This is also in chapter 10. What did Paul consider? What did Paul consider an ignorant standard of measurement? He's talking about these false teachers, and he says they're so ignorant. The way the standard they use to evaluate themselves. What is the standard that they use to evaluate themselves? Yeah, they judge themselves by looking at themselves. They judge themselves by looking at others like them. So instead of looking at God's standards, they look at their own standards, and they look pretty good. And he says, how ignorant, how misguided is that? Okay, I'd read the next question, but I can't read it, so I'm going to skip that one. It's pretty bad here. Okay. Did Paul consider himself a skilled or unskilled preacher, speaker? Yeah, 2 different times in this passage he talks about, at least obviously there's some charges being made against him where he's not very good at public speaking, which just kind of reminds me, I hope we get there tonight, where Paul talks about the thorn in the flesh, depending on which translation you read, the idea that he had some sort of physical problem. And wow, there have been a lot of guesses on this, and I had forgotten the fact that some people think that he may have had a speech impediment, because he mentions this 2 different times. It's never one that I bought into, and that's probably why it didn't register with me. But it's a possibility. It's one of the things that they said against him. And Paul's point was, hey, I may not be as slick, people, in fact, we know that people fell asleep while they were listening to Paul.
Yeah. Fell out of the window. Yeah, that's what they get.
Always remember that when I see somebody nodding off, remind myself, hey, it happened to the Apostle Paul. Okay, but the point he makes is, I may not be as skilled as far as the way the words are delivered, but he says, you know what? I speak the truth. So the content's there. I had a professor, I don't know if it's proper to name these guys or not, if I should or not, but his name was Russell Boatman, and that probably doesn't mean anything to 90% of the people in here. But I do remember him talking about, when he was talking about himself, he never considered himself a good speaker. And that went for the classroom too. And while he's talking to us in the classroom, he'd just be walking along, there'd be the trash can, and he'd go bam and kick the trash can. and he would do just the craziest things right during the middle of class, because he knew that he had a hard time keeping people's attention. But he also told us that he always focused, though, he said, I spend all my time making sure that what I say is true. And I think if you I'm partial to the people who work at saying it well. I really appreciate that. But you can say it well, and if you're not saying the truth, you're wasting everybody's time. The truth, by far, is most important. I don't want to go off of it. Anyway, that's one of the things that Paul says about himself. No one, last question, this is kind of where we left off from last week. No one will ever stop Paul from boasting about something. What does he mention in the 11th chapter? No one's ever going to take this away from me. What? This is in chapter 11, verse 10. Verse 10, as surely as the truth in Christ is in me, no one in all of Greece will ever stop me from boasting about this. What has he just been talking about?
Not a burden.
Yeah, I'm not a burden to you in what way?
Monetarily.
Yeah, I'm not going to take any pay. Not from them. He'll accept it from other people, but not from them. And to me, that's what makes so interesting that to these very people that he wouldn't take any money from, we have more in the Bible recorded on the subject of why you should give than any other place in the Bible. Well, that does kind of make sense, though, doesn't it? Because he wouldn't accept pay from them because they didn't understand it. So he's going to spend more time teaching them on the topic of why it's important to give than just about any other place in the Bible, because these are the people who didn't get it. Maybe that's why I'm so partial to 1st and 2nd Corinthians, because in so many ways the church at Corinth didn't get it. And that's why I love it so much, because it's like there's the place, there are so many topics in these letters where things are explained so well, at least in on my level, I can kind of get it. Okay, so he just said that in verse 10, and he says, why? Because I don't love you. God knows that I do. And by the way, in verse 11, this is where we left off. He's probably, I mean, take it at face value. He doesn't want them to misunderstand. You know, so many times you do something to be helpful to somebody else, and sometimes they understand it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they get it for the right reasons, sometimes they don't. But in all likelihood, I mean, I take that at face value, but in all likelihood, bigger argument here, this is probably one of the charges that the false teachers are making against Paul. So he's not just saying this just to make sure they understand, but he's probably saying this because those guys are saying that Paul doesn't care about you. You know, if he cared about you, you know, he'd accept your gifts, but he doesn't accept your gifts. That shows that he doesn't, and he says, no, it's the exact opposite. In fact, it's because I care about you so much that I don't want to be a burden to you. Verse 12, but I will continue doing what I've always done. This will undercut those who are looking for an opportunity to boast that their work is just like ours. So this is where, this is directly talking about, there are some people out there saying some things against Paul and his ministry, right? And ours, he's talking about the other people associated with the missionary journeys, the other people are telling the truth. But Paul, I kind of like this because Paul doesn't back away from mentioning people's names. Have you noticed this? Paul doesn't back away from mentioning people's names in his letters. And he doesn't back away from specifically talking about issues either. And he's going to answer a lot of these charges. By the way, I'm not sure I said that clear enough. But of course, Paul talks about Titus and Timothy, and he commends them to people. But he also talks about, what are the guys' names? Here, I shouldn't have brought this up unless I could remember, and I'm drawing a blank here. He talks about two guys to Timothy that you ought to kick out of the church. What are their names? Hymenaeus and
Alexander.
there you go. I'm so glad I came tonight. But you know, he doesn't say, and you know, there's some people you ought to kick out. No, he names them. And so I feel guilty sometimes until I read passages like that, and I think, you know what? If some of these evangelists on TV stand up and say some stuff that's just not biblical, I'm not so sure that it's a problem for us to say Kenneth Copeland makes some statements about God that are just contradictory to what the Bible says. And to mention a guy's name like that, I actually think is helpful, because so many people will turn and listen to Kenneth Copeland when he's not saying something false. And you know what? He's a pretty dynamic speaker. And you're listening to this guy and it's like, wow. And you might start to like him. Well, that's a real problem, because you start to like this guy, he's got a lot of, he's all over this word faith movement. And he believes that God is 6'2", and I don't even want to start down that path. I'm so sorry I went there. But Paul doesn't mind. Paul doesn't mind mentioning people, and he's not just mentioning them. He says this is going to undercut them. Does Paul want to bring these guys down?
Sure.
It sure sounds like it to me. Okay. He says these people are false apostles. So he's not beating around the bush. He's concerned because their souls might be in danger. He's concerned because of the damage that might be done here. And by the way, he wants to undercut them. Look at that verse 12 again. Those who are looking for an opportunity to boast that their work is just like ours. Why is it they're not going to be able to say their work is just like ours? I went over this a little too quickly. Paul just said in verse 10, he says, I am never going to give up this boast. What's my boast? I've not been a burden to you, and I've not taken any money. And he says, it's not because I don't love you, but you know what? I'm going to undercut those guys who boast that their ministry is just like ours.
And they're accepting gifts. And
Yes. They will never be able to say their ministry is just like ours. Why? Because they've got money in their pocket. And he says, and I have never done it. He has done that from other churches. He has never done it from them. And at the risk of saying this way too many times, why didn't Paul take money from them when he was willing to take it from a poor church at Philippi?
because the people of Corinth would take it the wrong way.
Exactly.
Would misunderstand it.
Not mature enough to understand.
Mature enough to understand. That's exactly right. There's this idea that not everybody's ready for the same stuff at the same time. And so there's a maturity level. Does that mean they shouldn't give at all? Well, no. You've got chapters 8 and 9. They're supposed to give. But as far as being able to support the minister, they haven't grown to that point yet. And Paul's not going to jeopardize their growth or that process. And he doesn't want to give opportunity to these guys who are not really presenting God's truth. They are false prophets. They are deceitful workers who disguise themselves as apostles of Christ. So they're not just coming in saying we're different from Paul. They're saying we are apostles. Well, the claim to be the claim of apostleship meant that that's about as high a status as far as authority goes in the early church. That's it. What you said, just like Paul told the church at Thessalonica, you accept it for what it really is, the word of God, not the word of men. Why? Because they're apostles. So to claim to be an apostle of Christ meant they were coming in and saying, listen, we said this and you have to accept it. And Paul's saying don't accept them as apostles because I don't want you to accept their teaching. And he says one of the ways you can tell this is because their motives are not pure. He's going to give them some other reasonings here. Verse 14. But I'm not surprised. I love his reasoning here. He says, I'm not surprised about any of this stuff. Even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. What point is he trying to make here? Say a little
They
louder.
belong to Satan. They are followers, so they're going to do the same thing.
They are playing right into Satan's game plan, and some of Satan's best work is done.
Pretending to be the
Yes.
truth.
Yeah. I am concerned about what atheists do, and I am concerned about those who attack Christianity, and I think we need to make a defense. But I think, based on scriptures like this, that we ought to be more concerned about, since I already mentioned Kenneth Copeland's name, people who present themselves as this is biblical and this is Christian, and they claim to be preachers of the gospel, and yet they are introducing stuff that really undercuts God being God and undercuts Jesus Christ being God and just undercuts the truth of Scripture. It does more damage because they're pretending to be doing something good. So Satan himself disguises himself as an angel of light. So of course these guys are going to try to present themselves as doing something good and representing God. Verse 15, so it's no wonder that his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Back in verse 6, he talks about the fact that they're slick in their speech. They're good at their presentation. In the end, they will get the punishment that their wicked deeds deserve. So he's reminding them, hey, listen, it's not fun to realize that you've been conned, right? It's not fun to realize we've been listening to somebody we shouldn't have been listening to. But he's also saying, don't worry about this fact. God's going to take care of them. But in the meantime, he doesn't want them to do any more damage than they've already done. So Paul's going to take some time to talk about his ministry, but he's going to come back and talk about these guys again because he's so concerned that they not be deceived. Verse 16, again I say, don't think that I am a fool. Again I say, don't think that I am a fool to talk like this, but even if you do, listen to me, as you would to a foolish person, while I also boast a little. Do you understand what he's doing here? He has already said this. This is where, since we've stretched it out over so many weeks, it's hard to see. But if you read these chapters together, Paul has said this a couple times, and he's going to say it a couple more times. He's going to say, I feel so silly doing this. Don't want to do this, but I need to do this. What is it? I need to talk about myself for just a minute. And the reason he needs to talk about himself and his own ministry is because he is an apostle, and he needs to make a distinction. They need to accept what he says because he's an apostle and not accept them. One of the commentaries I read, I think, nails it. They said, Proverbs 26, verse 5 says, answer a fool according to his folly. You know, there's a time when you don't answer a fool according to his folly. But there's other times where you do. You know, somebody wants to play that game, then okay, be careful. Let's go ahead and play that game. And what game are we playing here? Credentials. Why is it you should listen to me? You know, who has the best credentials? And Paul's saying, this is so silly. I feel so silly doing this. But you want to talk credentials? Okay. And then he starts talking credentials, and he keeps backing up saying, I feel so silly. By the way, why does he feel so silly doing this? Why does it bother him? If Paul is so well educated, and he is, if Paul has paid the price, and he has, and all this stuff he says is true, it is true, why does he feel foolish saying it?
His humility.
Excuse me?
His humility.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Paul definitely wants them following Jesus, not Paul. Remember how he said this back in 1 Corinthians chapter 3? He says, I didn't die for your sins. You know, it's not about Paul. It's not about Peter. We're all supposed to be focused on Jesus. So he doesn't want to focus on himself too much.
Doesn't want to come across as he's boasting, wants to still stay humble, wants, you know, all the other reasons for his not wanting to make it sound like he's boasting about.
Very true. Very true.
Doesn't he also think it's like almost a waste of time because he wants to just get the word out? And that's all he really wants to do is get the word to people instead of talking about himself. He wants to do, here's the word. Forget about me, here's the word.
Yes. There's also a great danger in going down this path, because if having more degrees and more prestigious background means I ought to listen to you, then we're in trouble. Because there are some people who have a lot of degrees and very prestigious position that teach some really stupid stuff.
Without opening up that way to where he's, you know, being humble at the same time, showing his credentials and backing up and saying that and recognizing it. If he just went on and just started talking, it would be them versus us, back and forth victory. And who do you believe in that? It's more believable when a guy does get a little bit more humble and say, okay, I don't know why I'm doing this, but, you know, okay, we need to talk about me. Yes, let's talk about me. And these are my credentials. But
Excellent. It's the best way to present it in a humble attitude, and it's also getting evidence out there. Hey, you know, they brought this up. Let's go ahead and get the evidence out there. And the first thing that he did, he already delivered a death blow, because he says, you know what, they'll never be able to beat me because they already accepted money from you. I've never done that. They'll never catch up. They will never catch up. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Look where he goes with this. He's going to start listing so many different things here. But he's answering a fool according to his folly. Otherwise, sometimes if you don't give an answer to a fool, then they'll think that they're right. So it's kind of like, okay, I'm gonna have to do this right now just to set the record straight. Verse 17, such boasting is not from the Lord, but I'm acting like a fool. And since others boast about their human achievements, I will too. Verses 17 and 18, some translations put that as a parenthetical statement. Probably is. He's probably just saying, you know what, this is not the best way to do things. This is not the way that God wants his ministry done. He's not saying that he's committing a sin here. He's just saying this is not the best way to do it. But he says, you know what? There's a lot of things that aren't the best way. This is Corinth. So, okay, we're going to have to do it this way but because of where you are. In case I didn't convey this very well earlier, I think there are a few books in the Bible that translate to modern day world better than Corinth. Because I just think that's where we are. I think we have the same kind of problems, the same kind of issues. Sorry if I seem too negative here, but I think, spiritually speaking, we're not very mature as a culture, as a time. Biblically literate? I don't think so. You've seen those interviews of the man on the street where they ask questions about
Oh,
the
yes.
10 Commandments or something. Oh, it's just,
I can almost hear, the other people that he's talking about at this time saying, "Who are you to judge me?"
oh yes. Oh yes.
With what you're having to say and everything, and his response to it, and something you said earlier. I said there's a certain amount of his motivation is because it's so close and personal at this point in time. Is that it's an intimate, interpersonal relationship between all these people and everything. There is some genuine concern on his part for the people that are doing this teaching and what they might be jeopardizing in themselves and everything. But taking this into today's society, and your comment about Copeland or any other, the Osteens or anybody else that's out there giving a less than accurate version,
Yeah.
You're more concerned when you make the statement, and I'm more concerned when I make the statement about their teachings for the people that are falling victim
Yeah.
to that. And this is in a microcosm kind of world where everybody knew these guys' names and everything, and we're hearing the word directly. But now with mass media, our greater concern is not Kenneth Copeland's soul, but the souls that he may be leading astray.
Well said, Dave, well said. In fact, in the context here, remember what Paul said in the previous chapter? He says, I want to present you like a pure bride to your husband Christ. And he says, that's why I'm so concerned, because these guys are coming along and they're taking away your virginity. They are messing you up. Instead of presenting you as the bride you ought to be for your husband. And so, he uses these kind of emotional pictures to tell us how much he's so concerned and so loves them. That's why he's not going to stand for these guys. It's kind of like the side of Paul that we see displayed so well in the book of Galatians, where Paul just gets mad. And he's really upset and mad because these people are taking people who are Christians and literally taking them away from Christ. And he's like, when you fall prey to these guys, it's not like, oh, life's not going to be as good. No, you are messing with your eternity. And so the stakes couldn't be higher. So he's willing to do what he has to do. Verse 19, after all, you will think that, after all, you think you are so wise, but you enjoy putting up with fools. Okay, he's probably saying, hey, I'm going to go ahead and play the part of a fool here, but you know what? You've already been putting up with fools. The very fact that you listen to these false teachers, you're already there. And what Paul's doing here is kind of like calling him on it. Let's go ahead and get the truth out here. Verse 20, you put up with it when someone enslaves you. Now look at this description in verse 20 of what these guys have been doing. They're not just teaching something false. He says you put up with it when they enslave you. Now, I seriously doubt they came in and put chains on them. What does he mean when he says they enslaved them?
Spiritual.
Yeah, and how do you do that to people mentally or spiritually? How do you enslave people?
We're kind of taking their thoughts captive.
Okay, instead of God taking their thoughts captive, you're taking their thoughts captive in a different direction. I'm thinking one of the groups that we know, in fact, made reference to the book of Galatians a little bit ago. What was the major issue there? Because he's not just talking about false teachers. He says what kind of false things they're teaching. What were they teaching? The Judaizers, what were they teaching? You remember this?
Talking about circumcision.
Yeah, why did you have to be circumcised? Because you have to become a Jew first before you can become a Christian. And if you're not circumcised, you don't do this stuff, which was just circumcision was just a symbol, an outward sign of a commitment to being a Jew first, which meant you had to keep the laws. And that's why he says in chapter 5, verse 4, those of you who are trying to be justified by law have fallen from grace. Well, when he mentions here that you are being enslaved, okay, their thoughts, spiritually, emotionally, but enslaved how? Legalistically. You're enslaved because you think, boy, if I don't do these 613 things, and if I don't do them perfectly, I'm lost. I've got to start, bring out the scales again. I got to start keeping track. If I'm not a good enough person, then I'm not right with God. He's saying you're being enslaved by their teaching. Let me read that again. You put up with it when someone enslaves you, takes everything that you have, Okay, no. They weren't just taking money. This sounds like they were taking a lot of money, doesn't it? Takes everything you have, takes advantage of you, takes control of everything, and what? What does your translation say? Mine says, slaps you in the face. Okay, these, I'm getting a kind of picture in my mind. The kind of teachers that come in here, and they're the kind of teachers, preachers, whatever, that are, you got to do this, you got to do that, and if somebody doesn't agree with them, what are they going to do?
Physically.
They get physical. And Paul is saying, you guys put up with that? Just because they are so dogmatic that they slap you around and they've got all this stuff, he says, you buy into that? He says, I'm ashamed to say that we've been too weak to do that. Well, what Paul's saying is, there's a difference between them and us. We're not that way. Didn't you notice that? Whatever they dare to boast about, and I'm talking like a fool again. Notice these little parenthetical statements. He says, we're going down this path. I really don't want to go. But he says, guys, let's go there. He says, I dare to boast about it too. He says, okay, since you've been taken captive by these guys, since you're following and listening to what they say, let's just get it out there. Are they Hebrews? He says, so am I. Okay, what's a Hebrew? Yeah. Do you guys have any translations that say anything different from a Jew or a Hebrew? It's probably making a distinction here between the Jews that were from the area of Palestine. And what he's saying is, I am one of those Jews that are from Palestine. Well, were there Jews not from Palestine? Yeah. Where were these Jews? In fact, opposed the other major category that's presented to us as the Hebrew Jews, what are the other Jews called?
Samaritans. I'm thinking of Samaritans.
No. Samaritans aren't Jews at all. They wouldn't consider them Jews at all. They consider them half-breeds. But if you're not from the area of Palestine, what did they call you in that day? You were considered Hellenized. What does that mean? What does it mean to be Hellenized?
To be engulfed in their culture.
In what
Transformed.
culture?
The Greek culture.
Greek. Hellenization would be the Greek influence. So you'd be considered a Grecian or a Greek Jew would be the other major category they use here. But he's saying, are you one of those pure Jews from the area of Palestine? He says, so am I. Which, by the way, you notice how he sets this up? As though it makes any difference. Right? But he says, you want to play that game? Okay. He says, are they from the right place? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Member of God's people? He says, so am I. Are they descendants from Abraham? Of course. So do we have the ancestry? Do we have all that stuff? Do we have the background? He says, they don't have anything on me. And from what little we know of Paul, it's such a dangerous thing to go down this path, because I don't think anybody could beat Paul. Do you remember this from our studies before, like in going through the book of Acts and everything? Paul was not just an overachiever, he was an overachiever of the best teachers of the day. In fact, we get the impression that Paul even thumbed his nose at the best teachers of the day. Kind of like, okay, I've sat under the best, and you know what? I think I know it a little bit better than they do. Yeah, Paul, so anyway, it's a dangerous path for them to go down, and Paul's like, okay, you want to go down this path? The Hebrew, the Israelite, descendant of Abraham, so am I. Are they servants of Christ? I know I sound like a madman. Again, this kind of like a little parenthetical thought here. He says, I have served him far more. In fact, boy, what an understatement, because in reality, these people aren't really serving Christ at all. They're really being used by Satan, which is interesting, because sometimes people who are being used by Satan don't even know they're being used by Satan. It says, I served him far more. I have worked harder. I've been put into prison more often, been whipped more times without number, faced death again and again. 5 different times the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. By the way, I know this is just an aside. Why 39 lashes?
40 minus 1.
Yeah, why 40 minus 1?
No, I can't remember the reason. That's
exactly right.
They overdid it, there was a punishment.
That's exactly right. And so if you go over 40, you violated the law. So they always stopped one short to make sure that they never violated the law, just in case somebody
I
miscounted.
think where that comes from, though, it was also, from what I understand, it was a very common understanding that 40 lashes would kill a person. Under that would not.
You know, yeah, and one of the distinctions is the Jews had a limit on their beatings. The Romans did not. And I think it's Josephus who tells us in this, we get into this with Jesus being flogged, because using the cat of nine tails with the, with the pieces of pottery and rock and things like that in there would literally rip through the muscles. And Josephus is the one who tells us sometimes internal organs fell out. So we're not just talking about, whip, whip, whip. We are talking about things that bring somebody close to the point of death. In fact, Paul's going to mention that he did die. I'm getting ahead of myself. But 5 different times the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes, which, by the way, I find it interesting that he mentions it's the Jewish leaders that have done this. His opponents, if they are the Judaizers, which in all likelihood they are the very people who want them to become Jews again before they become Christians. And Paul's saying, hey, I'm the real apostle, which, by the way, the Jewish leaders don't like me. Boy, that's been the case again and again in his ministry. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. That's the one that gets me. In fact, some of us think that because, remember that this is recorded for us, it happened at Lystra. Remember they stoned him and left him for dead. And remember what the Bible says next? It says he got up and went on it. And I'm thinking, how? One of the arguments that they make in some of the apologetic books about crucifixion is the fact that the Romans knew what they were doing when they crucified people. So it wasn't like, not sure if he's dead or not. The Romans knew what they were doing, right? Well, listen, the Jews' form of execution was stoning. And generally speaking, they knew what they were doing when they stoned people. And so when they stoned them and left them for dead, probably left for dead. And again, I don't want to go overboard on this, but the very fact that he just gets up and walks into town afterwards, I do think something miraculous is going on there. Something supernatural that God's doing through his life. But anyway, he's saying he was stoned 3 times. I was shipwrecked. Once I spent the whole night and day adrift at sea. And one of the things that's so intense about that is when you're adrift at sea all day, all night, you don't know if it's going to be for 40 days and nights. You don't know how long it's going to be. You don't know how long it's going to be. And verse 26, I've traveled on many long journeys. I faced dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers. I faced dangers from my own people. Again, he's talked about the Jewish leaders, and he talks about. Do you remember when Paul comes back? And again, I go to Acts because the book of Acts gives us so much. Which, by the way, the book of Acts just kind of skims the surface on this. In fact, this is one of the reasons it's easy when you're reading the book of Acts to get caught up in this idea, well, the book of Acts is about Paul. No, it's not. It's not about Paul. It's about the advance of the gospel. It's just Paul played an intricate part of that. And this is one of those passages that lets us know there was a whole lot more going on with Paul that Luke never deals with in the book of Acts. But once you get that, when you come to the book of Acts, because at the end of the book of Acts, sorry I'm talking so much about Acts, but when you get to the end of the book of Acts, if you're thinking it's about Paul, you're terribly disappointed, because it's kind of like, why did he stop? What happened to Paul? you know what I mean? Because he's not talking about Paul. He's talking, remember the last word in the Greek language, do you know this, what the last word is in the book of Acts? And again, the word order, we change it in the English language, but the last word in the book of Acts is unhindered. And the idea is the gospel just kept going out. Nobody can stop it. Well, Paul's a great example of that. But that's not what the book of Acts is about. But anyway, from here, there are a whole lot of these beatings and a whole lot of these things that happen. Yeah, the shipwreck is mentioned. Yeah, the stoning is mentioned. And when it talks about danger from his own people, I can't help but to think about when he comes back to Jerusalem and these false charges that he brought somebody into the temple when he really didn't. And then when he was brought before the Romans, it was the Jews who hired the lawyer to go bring the charges against him. And not only that, remember the guys who said, we're not going to eat. They all had this pact. We're on a hunger strike until we kill Paul. You know, it's like all these things, and that's his own people, right? In fact, when he was at Damascus, when he was first converted, right, after the light experience, and then Ananias talks to him and he gets baptized. What does he do right away? It says he goes to the synagogue and starts proving to people that the Messiah has to be Jesus, and everybody's saying, "Is this the guy?" You know, he was the guy who was going to come to, you know, persecute Christians, and now he's proving this. And so, what did the Jews do there? Damascus, right when he becomes a Christian, they're like, they put people out watching for him to come out of the city because they're going to ambush him and kill him right away, right?
Out the window.
So they had to lower him in a basket to get him out and sneak him out by night. That's the very first experiences he had, right? That's the way his life started as a Christian. And you know what? Didn't change. Just about everywhere he went, he gets this kind of opposition. Anyway, he says he has these dangers from his own people, the Jews, as well as from Gentiles. But it kind of is extra salt in the wound to realize your own brothers are turning against you. I face dangers in the city, dangers in deserts and on the seas. I have faced danger from men who claim to be believers, but they're not. You know, underline that. It's kind of like these very guys that we're talking about here at Corinth. He says, I have worked hard and long, endured many sleepless nights. I've been hungry and thirsty. I've gone without food. Now, this is so interesting to me because this could apply to so many different times in his life, but maybe, hey, I never took a penny from you guys. And maybe while he was there, maybe there was some periods of fasting because I know he worked. He also made tents. And he accepts support from other churches, but in between, he's more than willing to go without it. That's what it takes. He had. Remember, he tells the church at Philippi, I've learned to be content with much or with very little. So he's gone through both extremes. I've shivered in the cold without enough clothing to keep me warm. You know what I think of when I read that verse? And I know he's talking about stuff that's already happened. But you know one of the last things that Paul ever says? One of the last requests that he makes from Timothy, do you remember this? He says, bring the parchments that I've been working, and what else does he ask for?
Clothes.
Yeah. In his weakened condition there. Okay, by the way, pause for just a second. How is all this suffering proof of his apostleship? Because the context here, he's saying, let's go ahead and compare credentials. I'm thinking, okay, show me your degrees, show me where you've taught, and stuff like that. And that's not where Paul goes. Paul goes to how many times he's been beaten, how much he's suffered, all the stoning, all that. How's that proof?
That he's willing to suffer.
Yeah.
You really have the conviction
Oh my.
of your teaching.
Oh my. You can't accuse Paul of just a fair weather follower. Does he believe this stuff? Boy, does he believe this stuff. He's believed it so much, it's worth laying his life down for and suffering. In fact, there are some fates worse than death, and Paul seems to have experienced all those kinds of things in his life. Wow. Then besides all this, I have the daily burden of my concern for all the churches. Again, in the context here, I don't want us to take this too lightly because he's just talked about how many, 5 times 39 lashes, being stoned, all this stuff. And he says, besides all that, he says, my concern for the church is who is weak without my feeling the weakness, who is led astray, and I do not burn with anger. Just a couple quick comments here, and you guys probably understand this so much better than I, but I can remember, I know this is so silly, but I have very few vivid memories of when I was really little. But I have a very vivid memory of the very first time my sister told a lie. Because it was about me. And I'm quite sure I lied before. And I'm quite sure I did a bunch of stuff, but my sister was a good girl. And I just remember her telling my mom, And I just couldn't believe it. And I also knew I had absolutely no credibility because if I said what she said wasn't true, Mom was going to believe her because she was really good, you know. But it was the reason I remember that so well. I know he's pretending like he's not. The reason I remember that so well as a little kid, it's the first time I remember really being hurt. It had nothing to do with getting a spanking or anything like that. I couldn't believe my sister, you know, because my sisters really were good people. They are. They are.
Somebody hit the button.
And I didn't tell you which one either. So I'm gonna leave it at that because let me tell you why that comes to mind. When we talk about, because you know, Paul goes into detail of all the suffering here, but usually when you think of suffering in the Bible, I don't know about you, but I'm just the crucifixion. You know, I'm so drawn to that. But I'm also so impressed with the fact the Bible spends very little time talking about the physical torture that Jesus went through. We know how terrible it was because of extra biblical documentations. We learn a lot of things from Josephus about the floggings. We learn a lot from Roman historians and early church fathers from the crucifixions. The Bible, you go through and you look, it mentions the flogging and it talks about the crucifixion, talks about the crown of thorns, talks about some of those things. Doesn't spend a lot of time on what he went through physically. And I think there's a reason for that, because what he went through physically was minuscule compared to what he went through spiritually, compared to what he went through that I'm sure we'll never be able to fathom. But I think Paul gives a hint at this when he says, you know what, I've gone through all this junk. He says, but I also, on the inside, suffer so much because these are like my children. These are like the bride a father's trying to present to a husband. And he says, when things happen to them, I hurt. And it's a kind of hurt that goes well beyond, you know, if you're a parent, you can kind of relate to this. You know, there's so many times where you see your kid suffer and you think, I wish it would have been me cutting my arm. You know what I mean? Instead of whatever. If I must boast, I would rather boast about things that show how weak I am. What does he mean by that? He's really showing the difference between himself and these other guys who are bragging about everything, doesn't he? He says, I would rather show how weak I am. God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who worthy of eternal praise, knows that I am not lying. He calls on God to be his witness. When I was in Damascus, the governor, by the way, he's going to talk about his weakness even more in the next chapter. He's going to go into greater detail and talk about his thorn in the flesh. But then he's making reference here to being in Damascus. We talked about this just a minute ago. The governor, under King Artaxerxes, I said that wrong. Artaxerxes kept guards at the city gate to catch me. He said, I had been lowered in a basket through the window of the city wall to escape from him. We already talked about that too. Chapter 12, he says, this boasting will do no good, but I must go on. I will reluctantly tell about visions and revelations from the Lord. He says, you know what, guys, I've just started. He says, there's so much more I can say. He says, don't want to, but I'm going to. He says, I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Okay, sometimes the Jews refer to 7 heavens, but typically they would also refer to the 3 heavens. What are the 3 heavens?
Where the birds fly.
Okay, where the birds fly. What's the second
Stars.
heaven? Stars. What's the third heaven?
Where God is.
Yeah, which would be beyond the physical realm. So the idea here is caught up to paradise, some translations will say, caught up to the third heaven. In other words, had an out-of-body experience. Look at the way he describes this. I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. Which, by the way, from what I understand, because when I looked at this, a lot of times I think of what happened to Paul at Lystra. But it never dawned on me before, if you look at what he says about the 14 years ago, he's probably talking about a different experience, because 14 years ago doesn't really match up with what took place at Lystra. You know, unless I've got the dating of the book wrong. So what that tells me is, because it makes a powerful point either way, but what that tells me is, not only was he stoned at Lystra, in addition to that, he had another experience. And he doesn't say what caused it, but it looked like he died. Wow. How could all this happen to one guy, right? But he said, whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. Yes, only God knows whether I was in my body or outside my body. But I do know that I was caught up to paradise and heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things that no human is allowed to tell. You know what gets me about this? Paul is happy to mention the fact that it happened, but he doesn't go into detail to talk about what happened. He doesn't say, I saw the bright light, and I could see my body down there. Doesn't go into all those details. And yet, if anybody was qualified to do that, Paul was qualified to do that. But you know what? He doesn't want us to put our faith and our hope in things like that. He wants us to keep our faith and hope in the truth. And the reason I'm saying this is, I do not doubt that people have had these experiences. I'm very much concerned when people start reading these books and want to base what they believe on the afterlife based on what those books said. Listen, what we know about the afterlife, we know for sure because God said it. And the reason, let me give you another reason, because I don't want to just make this statement. There's a book called Beyond Death's Door, which was written by a Christian cardiologist. And in this book, he documents, this is an old book, but he documents this, where these people who have these after-death experiences, he said, so many times you only hear one flavor of that. But he says there have also been some afterlife experiences where the total opposite happens, and yet it's so traumatic that a couple weeks later when you interview these people, they say, oh yeah, it was bright light, it was a wonderful thing, and he's there, and he was there when they died, and he heard him scream, and he knew that it wasn't a positive experience. So a lot of the details are contradictory from these stories. The point is, something's happening to people after they die. Okay, Paul mentions that fact. Yeah, there's an experience after life, but he doesn't go into details. And I kind of think it misses the point to go into the details other than the fact that it actually happens. We're out of time, aren't we? Okay, this is a good place to stop because he's right in the middle and he's going to say a lot more things about his suffering, so we'll pick up at verse 5 next week.
I'd just like to point out that if we were in the 70s, we all would have run outside if we heard a rocket.
Yeah.
We did.
Common place.
Questions, comments?
So he was pretty much, Paul, he was at as much fervor when he was hunting Jesus as he is now, even more so.
Yes.
Now, when Jesus taught along with the apostles, where did he go? Which heaven did he go to?
Okay, when he was taught, that's separate from going to heaven. When he was taught, because we learned this at Galatians 1 and 2, he goes into a little bit of defense too, and he said that he was taught for 3 years, which I find very interesting because the apostles, the other 12 were taught 3.5 years. He went to Arabia, it says. So he's taken to Arabia and he's taught there. Yeah. Good point, but that's separate from this out-of-body experience. Good point though about the zeal, and he makes that point more than just here. He makes that point over in the book of Galatians too about, you talk about zealous, nobody's as zealous as I was. Yeah.
Mark, were Judaizers on the Sanhedrin? Where did they get the authority to flog?
Yeah. Okay. Where did they get the authority to do the flogging?
Yeah. I mean, were they part of the Sanhedrin? Did they coerce the Sanhedrin into giving them the authority? I mean,
You know, that's an interesting question. I'm going to let him answer that because I don't know that I know that they were part of the Sanhedrin or not. Were they part of the Sanhedrin, the Judaizers?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Judaizers were people that had become Christians.
But you still thought you had to be Jews.
And
Right.
Yeah.
So they would not be part of the Sanhedrin, because the Sanhedrin was made up of Jews that had not become Christians.
That's right.
They pushed the law on.
But we also know from the book of Acts that some of the Pharisees became Christians, because in
Right.
chapter 15 it says some from the Pharisee sect were the ones who opposed Paul. So your question though is, what was the legality?
Right.
I'm not so sure they were concerned about legality.
Oh, they just took them out back and hung them.
Well, that's what they did at Lystra. They just took him out of town and stoned him.
Okay.
And if I'm remembering correctly, they weren't allowed to carry out the death penalty. The only reason Rome gave them permission to is if somebody violated the boundary on the temple, gave them permission, but they weren't allowed to take people out and stone them, but they did it anyway.
I see.
When they could get
That's a
away
good
with
question.
it. Yeah.
It's a good question.
I was gonna say.
Yeah.
They had to wait with Jesus because they knew they couldn't do it without the Romans noticing.
Right.
They had to go and get it done right.
But in the process of doing that, they violated their own law by having court at night. So they were violating their own law time and time again. Anybody else want to ask a question I can't answer? You're dismissed.
Stumped